Anyway, hello, thank you for coming, and again, Chodesh Tov. First, the shir tonight is dedicated, Refuah Shlema for Baruch ben Frida, and for Rabbi Dr. Yisroel Rifkin, Yisroel ben Chaya Chasha. Actually, I knew Rabbi Rifkin for a number of years. They lived in West Hartford. He and his wife lived in West Hartford, and he was one of the, an important mashpia on my life as I was growing up. And Baruch Hashem, they live in Yerushalayim now, and Chash of a person, he should have Refuah Shlema. And this is dedicated by the Questels. Are they here? Okay. But we're very grateful for that. And again, he should have Refuah Shlema for the liberation of Eretz Yisrael from its enemies, safe return home of all the soldiers and hostages, lasting unity of the people of Israel, and for all of those whose health has been affected by the war, as well as dedicating the shir to the release of Arvin Netanel ben Sonia Tziyona in Iran, Aliyat Neshamot, Yitzchak Hirsh ben Eliezer, and in memory of all who have been murdered since October 7 by Jaacov and Devorah Shore, and I want to welcome him from California. And finally, Yiboneh has launched its annual campaign to collect and distribute tzedakah to the needy this coming holiday season. The list of recipients has, of course, increased due to the dire situation of displaced families, which is a major problem. I'm sure that everyone here is aware of this. Even though we in the center don't necessarily experience it directly, we need to be aware of the fact that literally thousands and thousands of families have been uprooted and Pashut just need basic survival resources. And a link to contribute can be found below, as well as on the Yiboneh website. And as we know, we are approaching the Yemei Hadin, the days of judgment, and Chazal teach us, Teshuva, Tefillah, and Tzedakah take away the evil decree, and therefore Teshuva, Tefillah, of course we do, and Tzedakah is especially important the whole year, but especially before the Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur season. Okay, so our Parsha this week is a very interesting Parsha, Parshas Teitzei. A little bit of information. Parshas Teitzei has over 70 mitzvos. Of the 613 mitzvos, Teitzei has over 70. It grabs a huge share. It is by far the Parsha with the largest number of mitzvos in it. That's quite amazing. I want to focus, though, on a few mitzvos that are clumped together at the very beginning of the Parsha. The first is the very, very difficult mitzvah to understand about the Eisha Shefas Tohar, the woman that is a captive of war, where the Torah gives you a ritual where essentially a soldier somehow has permitted to have intercourse with her, and we'll talk about that, bi'arichos. Then it refers to an unrelated law, apparently, that if a person has two wives, because polygamy was permitted, one wife that he loves, one wife that he hates, but the firstborn son happens to be born to the wife that he hates, the Torah says, even that son must get the double portion of the Bechor. You cannot prefer the son of the beloved wife over the son of the hated wife. And then we have another mysterious law in the Torah of a rebellious son whose parents bring him to the Beit Din, and he is actually stoned to death because of his rebelliousness. Now, these three mitzvot apparently have no thematic connection. Rashi does draw a connection, just to mention the connection that Rashi draws. And Rashi says, all of these are a consequence of that improper relationship with the captive of war, meaning, okay, the Torah allows it. And again, we'll talk about why that's so in a minute. But don't think you get away scot-free. Any child you have is likely to become rebellious off the derech. And ultimately, this woman whose inception of a relationship was impure, you will come to hate. So therefore, the hateful woman is none other than the Eisha Shefat Tohar, and the Ben Sorer Umoreh is the child of the Esher Shafat Torah, and that's kind of the connection in which the Torah is allowing it with its right hand, but it's also telling you, better not go there because there's all sorts of negative and nasty consequences that will come from that relationship. I'm going to go backwards a little bit because I want to just share with you a fascinating, interesting halachic ha'ora of the Vilna Gaon, and then a parenting ha'ora of an unknown source about Ben Sora Umore. First, the fascinating halachic observation of the Vilna Gaon. In the Parsha, when it talks about the man has two wives, a beloved wife and a hated wife. So what does it say? So it says, Kisi aliyah shtei nashim. If a man has two wives, one is beloved, one is hated, and the ben habachor, and the older child, the older lo banim, ha'uva v'asnua, the beloved wife and the hated wife have given birth to children. V'haya haben habachor lasniya, and the firstborn is to the hated wife. So the Torah says, Lo yuchal levaker, you cannot prefer the second one to the ahuva, to the bechor of the snua. A bechor gets pishnayim. So the emes is, the pasuk seems to be an inconsistent sequence, because it says, V'yoldu lo banim, these wives gave birth to children, the ahuva and the snua. That implies the beloved wife gave birth first. Ho'ahuva v'hasnua. Then it says the ben habachor is to the snua. Right? There's a bit of a contradiction. V'yoldu lo banim ho'ahuva v'hasnua v'haya ben habachor lasniya. Right? So why does it say v'yoldu lo ho'ahuva v'hasnua? It should say v'yoldu lo hasnua v'ahuva. So the Vilna Gaon used this sequencing to answer a shaila that he was asked halacha l'maisa. First of all, he says, what does the Torah possibly mean that you hate your wife? How can you hate your wife? Halachically, you're not allowed to hate another Jew. L'maisa, people do it, unfortunately. We have hate all the time, but halachically, So the answer must be, as Chazal say, that when we use the word snua, this refers to a situation where a sin like adultery was committed, and you're mechuyev to divorce your wife, right? If a woman commits adultery intentionally, so the halacha is the husband is mechuyev to divorce her. So here was the shaila. A man divorced his wife because she had committed adultery, but she was pregnant. He divorced his wife when she was pregnant. Again, that's a sad situation, pregnant from him, not from the adulterer. He then married another woman a month later. Woman number 2 gave birth prematurely after 8 months. Woman number 1 gave birth after 9 months, and even though she was pregnant first, the child was born afterwards. So the question is, when a bechor has the right to pishnayim, to a double portion, is the definition of bechor defined as first in conception or first in birth? So the Vilna Gaon says, I'll prove to you that pishnayim is based on conception rather than birth, because that's exactly what the pasuk says. The man has 2 wives, the ahuva and the snua. The yoldu lo banim ha'ahuva v'asnua. In terms of birthing a child, the beloved wife gave birth first. She gave birth after 8 months. And still the Torah says the ben habachor is the first wife because she was first in conception. And therefore the Vilna Gaon derived from this pasuk that the definition of bechor for the Yerusha of a double portion is based on conception rather than birth. Now, Lamaisa, this would be a real issue when you had polygamy, when a man could have more than one wife, or a man divorced a wife and took another wife. If you simply are monogamous, so to speak, you're not going to have the shaila. But the truth is, theoretically, it could apply even in modern-day fertility technologies. If you have an IVF fertilization, and a given embryo is fertilized first, but that, for whatever reason, that's not the first one that's implanted, you'd have the same shaila. Is the bechor the first to be born, or is the bechor the first to be implanted? The Vilna Gaon is medayek from the psukim that pishnayim of bechor is based on conception rather than birth. Now, this is fascinating. This is a well-known Devar Torah that is said in the name of the Vilna Gaon, and it's recorded in Svarim of the Vilna Gaon's teaching. But the great Nitziv, Rabbi Toli Tzvi Berlin, who is the great Rosh Hashiva of Volozhin, who himself married the granddaughter of Rav Chaim of Volozhin, who was the Vilna Gaon's principal disciple, greatest disciple, actually said, it is impossible that the Vilna Gaon says such a thing, because it is a davar pashut ma'ot, that halachically, again, we won't go into the proofs, but there are many, many proofs that the kviyut of Bechor, the establishment of Bechor, is not based on conception, it is based on birth. And the Nitziv actually concluded, the only thing I could say is that some Talmid who heard this avort misunderstood what the Vilna Gaon was saying and simply recorded it inaccurately. So it's very, very fascinating. Although the Devar Torah is pretty explicit, but it's not the Vilna Gaon's own words, it's a Talmud writing up what the Vilna Gaon says. The Nitziv was willing to simply say, it is wrong. Now, obviously, the Nitziv would never argue with the Vilna Gaon. In Lithuania, anyway, that was almost a capital crime. I mean, Chalak and the Vilna Gaon, you were in big trouble. But he didn't argue with the Vilna Gaon, but he simply said the Talmud misunderstood what the Vilna Gaon said. So that's a fascinating issue, which means halachically we don't paskin like this Devar Torah. Halachically we paskin that the kviyut of Bechor is based on birth rather than conception. Now the truth of the matter is, there are some interesting midrashim that actually want to make that point about Jaacov and Esav. Again, there are some midrashim that basically say that, and this is the idea of Yaakov holding on to the heel, that Yaakov, they were not identical twins, pretty obviously. They were fraternal twins, and Yaakov was conceived before Esav. It's like two marbles in a tube, where the first marble will be higher than the other marble, and Esav came out first, and therefore Yaakov getting the birthright was actually legitimate because Yaakov was the first for conception. Right? So some want to bring in the Yaakov and the Esav midrash on that story, but once again, it's not really clear because the Torah does describe Yaakov getting the Bechira as deception, even though it was justified deception, as opposed to a halachic entitlement per se. So that was just a halachic observation, just to share with you a very fascinating take on the pasuk. Now we come to the rebellious son. So I'm coming in reverse order. I'll go back to Yefas Torah. We come to the rebellious son. We have a very interesting thing. The Torah does not really say what he did. The Torah does not say what he did. So the man is rebellious son. Einenu shomeya v'kol aviv v'kol imo. He does not listen to his father and mother. We bring him to the Beis Din, and he gets executed. So there's a whole parak in Masechah Sanhedrin. It's a short parak, but it's about called Ben Sorah Umoreh, that goes through the Ben Sorah Umoreh, and it basically explains a number of points that make this a very unique case. Number one, the kid is not even bar mitzvah. There's actually a very narrow window of opportunity when somebody can be characterized as a rebellious son. It's 12 years old before he's 13, etc. And what does the kid do? He does some very, very specific stuff. He steals meat and wine from his parents, and he's a rebellious son, and he can get executed. Now, this is very, very strange. I mean, number one, he's not bar mitzvah yet. He's not adult. Number two, theft is bad from anybody, but, theft is not a chiyuv misa. You don't get the death penalty for theft. So why is the Ben Sorah Umoreh killed? He's stoned. So the Mishnah says in Sanhedrin, a very fascinating point. The Mishnah says in Sanhedrin that he's not killed because of what he did. What he did would not have justified any type of punishment of that magnitude. He's killed because of what he will become. Preventative. Not punitive, preventative. Nidain al shem sofa. He is judged for what will eventually happen, because Chazal described the idea that he starts stealing, and eventually this is addictive behavior, and addictive behavior could ultimately culminate in murder. And therefore, Chazal say the Torah's philosophy is, Yamus Zakai, let him die in a relative state of innocence, V'yal Yamus Chayav, and not die in a state of mortal sin. It is to his benefit to die early. Now, Chas v'shalom Rachmana litzlan, every year there are parents who actually make this calculation. I mean, either they go to jail or they're committed to a mental hospital, in which, the fundamentalist Christians, you had some. I mean, I'm not generalizing it all there, but in which they feel their daughter is not behaving in the right way. They'll take her life and they'll say, "This is for the sake of God, so she should die pure and chaste." Now, the obvious reason why we consider that wrong is that I, as a human being, can never judge a person based on what I think they're going to do. How on earth do I know that? That's impossible. But the one entity that can make those judgments is, of course, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Only HaKadosh Baruch Hu can judge a person based on what they will do. We, at best, can judge a person based on what he did, but Nidan al Shem Sofo is Masur to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And in reality, this is part of the logic behind Amalek and the eradication of the 7 nations, because people always ask the question, hey, what type of business is this? The Torah supports genocide. The Torah says, go and wipe out the babies of Amalek. Go and wipe out the women and the children of the 7 nations of Canaan. They're not fighting against you. They're not waging war against you. What type of religion would say you kill everybody? The truth is, as the Sefer HaChinuch says, there's a Nidan al Shem Sofo here. Because even though at this moment in time, the children might be cute and innocent and very nice, essentially they'll grow up to be Hitlers. Many of you might remember, I think I mentioned it before, the short story by Roald Dahl, D-A-H-L, the British writer, about saving baby Hitler. It's kind of a thought experiment about this cute little adorable baby that's dying in the middle of the night, has whooping cough, and the mother summons the doctor, and the doctor sees a mother that loves this baby and cares about this baby and cries and sobs and weeps and says, "This is my life. Please, please, please help." And the doctor's heart is opened up, to help this poor woman who loves the child so much. And let's imagine if at that moment you had absolute clarity that this is going to be Hitler, who's going to kill 6 million Jews, millions of other people as well. What's the compassionate thing to do? What is the rachamim? Is the rachamim to take care of this poor little baby that's crying? Or is the rachamim to kill the kid right away? Without getting into the philosophical conundrums of changing the past, right? There are numerous science fiction stories, particularly about Hitler, but going back to the time machine. Okay, I'm not getting into all of those issues. But once again, you see from that story that short-term rachamim is not necessarily true rachamim. Short-term rachamim, and of course we experience this with Hamas all the time here, the short-term rachamim can be very, very destructive. Chazal indeed say, if you're merachem on those who deserve cruelty, you will eventually be cruel to those who deserve rachamim. That's how it is. So the Nidan al Shem Sofo comes up with Ben Sorer Umoreh, and I think it ultimately comes up with Amalek, and it comes up with the 7 nations who inhabited Canaan. However, there is an interesting contradiction to that idea, that God judges me based on my future performance, and not only what I've already done. And that is the story of Yishmael. Difficult question, right? In fact, we read this the first day of Rosh Hashanah. It's going to be the Torah reading of the first day of Rosh Hashanah, where Sarah basically tells Avram, we got to get rid of Yishmael. He's a bad influence. He's mocking Yitzchak in his service to God. So Avram expels, so to speak, Hagar and Yishmael, and they wander in the desert, and Yishmael is dying of thirst. And Hagar prayed, but it actually says Hashem listened to the voice of Yishmael. And the pasuk says they saw a well, or Hagar saw a well, which means the well was always there. She didn't see it. Hashem opened eyes. That itself is a very important musar. The blessings of Hashem are all over the place. Problem is, we don't have eyes to see. Okay. But be it as it may, but it says, Vayishma Hashem l'kol anar, Hashem listened to the voice of the young man. So not Hagar's prayer, but Yishmael's prayer, which, by the way, is the source of our trouble to this very day, that Yishmael has a certain koach of prayer. I don't want to elaborate on that, because apparently, whenever I mention this, there's some Arab group that puts me on YouTube and says how I support the righteousness of the Muslim cause. So I got to be really, really careful about everything I say. But it does say that Hashem listened to the prayer of Yishmael, V'yasher hu sham, because he's there. That's a superfluous phrase, because he's there. So what do Chazal say? That when Hashem was going to save Yishmael, the Malachei Asharei said to God, more in Rosh Hashanah, how can you save this guy? His descendants are going to persecute and kill so many Jews. How can you let him die? He's the Hitler. And Hashem said, Hasher hu sham, I look at him now. Now? The lashon of the Gemara is now he's a tzaddik. I don't think the Gemara can mean now he's a tzaddik. I mean, obviously, if Avram sent him away, he wasn't a tzaddik, but now he's not deserving of death. He's a relative tzaddik. And I don't judge people, Hashem says, based on what they're going to do. I judge people based on where they are now. And right now, he's not deserving. So, the obvious question is, there is a contradiction between the philosophy of Ben Sorer Umoreh, which is Nidon al Shem Sofo, and Hashem's Gezerah on Yishmael, which is called Asher hu sham. And by the way, Asher hu sham comes in very useful to us on the Yom Adin, because Hashem knows in the course of a year we will tend to sin and go astray. But if on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur our tshuva is sincere, we are zocha to Hashem's rachamim, even though in the course of the year we're going to fail, because Asher hu sham, this is who I am right now. I don't mean insincere tshuva, where at the time of your tshuva you're thinking about the averos you're going to do. That's a different thing. But if we genuinely are sincere, there's a madrega called Asher hu sham. So there is a fundamental contradiction between Nidain al Shem Sofo and the idea of Asher hu sham. Nidain al Shem Sofo, Hashem looks at future consequences. Asher hu sham is Hashem looks at you now and does not take into account the future. So the Emes says this is a kasha of the Marsha. The Marsha himself, the great commentator, raises the question. The answer he gives is actually a very difficult answer, but there are two answers that he gives. Answer number one is that in the case of Yishmael, the active persecution is not Yishmael doing it later, it's his descendants. So Ben Sorer Umoreh, he himself is going to engage in the murder and the violence. So Hashem will look at that future. By Yishmael, it's an issue of his descendants. So Hashem will not use the descendants of the person as a factor against him. But Hashem may use his own future misbehavior. Of course, that teretz doesn't help us very much on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. Right? According to the Marsha, you couldn't use the Asher hu sham argument, Lagabe committing averos in the future. Okay. The second teretz he gives is also a difficult teretz. And that is, he says that the Ben Sorer Umoreh has already exhibited the destructive behaviors that will culminate in murder. He's already started down the path. As opposed to Yishmael, who did not yet start on that path of evil. Once again, l'chara, that itself is a difficult answer. Obviously, Yishmael did start on a path of evil, otherwise Avram would not have expelled him. So I'm going to have to leave this as something for you to think about. I'll think about it, you'll think about it, and we still have time before Rosh Hashanah. But for now, I just want to call to your attention the very interesting tension and contradiction, apparently, between the Ben Sorer Umoreh situation and the Asher hu sham of Yishmael. And I would also add that with Amalek and the 7 nations, we're apparently using the paradigm of Nidon al Shem Sofo, as opposed to looking at where they are now, because the baby Amalek is not a bad kid right now. But God is saying he'll become a Hitler, we got to get rid of him right now. Okay. But there's another aspect of Ben Sora Mora I just want to mention, and that is there's an opinion in the Gemara that says this never happened. There never was such a case. The halachic requirements are so strict and unusual that there literally was never a case where these laws were met, and therefore no 12-year-old was ever put to death because of a Ben Sora. Now, immediately after the Tana says, Lo hayav lo nivra, it never was, another rabbi says, oh, for sure there was. I was there and I sat on his grave. So apparently, how do you understand that machlokas? One said never happens. Right? We like to say in all machloksim, elu v'elu divrei elokim chayim. Right? One says kosher, one says treif. In God's book, both are legitimate views. Well, you can hear an elu v'elu divrei elokim chayim on matters of halacha. Hashem accepts either psak as a valid psak. But it's very hard to have elu v'elu divrei elokim chayim on a matter of historical record. One says, never happened. The other says, for sure it happened. Is there elu v'elu on that? Again, I'll leave that for you to think about as well. But one of the reasons why it's lo hayav lo nivra, it never happened, like that opinion, is because the halachos are very unusual. And I want to mention 2 unusual halachos. It mentions that, number 1, the father and the mother must have the same voice. Their voices must sound the same. Husband and wife must sound, Gezeres HaKosov, because it says, Einenu Shomeya, he doesn't listen to Kol Aviv Imo, the voice of his father and mother, and it's only one word voice, meaning father and mother sound exactly the same. You're not going to get that often, right? So that's one reason. And another rule the Gemara says is, and again, these seems to be out of the blue, just rules that don't make any sense to us, that if the father or the mother is deaf, Gezeres HaKosov, we have drashas, there's no din of Sorah Umorah. So again, Gezeres HaKosov, just technical rules, but what's the sense of it? But the Bali Musar say there's actually a very interesting symbolic meaning to these technical requirements. And that is, here you have a kid, and a kid rebels, and the kid is going off the derech. And obviously, the Torah, by indicating he gets the death penalty, in theory at least, is indicating that the kid is achra'i, that he's responsible, that he's Hashem, that he's guilty. But in order for someone to be responsible for going off the derech, there had to have been a consistency. When it says the father and the mother have the same voice, even though halachically it actually means they sound the same, but allegorically it means they speak with the same voice. They have the same message. They share the same values. They're on the same page. Now, of course, men and women are different. Of course, father and mother are different. That's a fact of life. And no one is saying father and mother interact with their children in exactly the same way. In some houses, some homes, it'll be, wait until your father comes home. Other houses, it'll be, wait till mommy comes home. Right? That's right. In every family, there's usually one is more of the disciplinarian, one is not. But that's a separate issue. That's just a matter of style. But fundamental values. What is the vision you want to communicate? What is the type of home you want to create? What is the type of child you want to mold? If the kid hears 2 different visions, if father and mother do not speak with a unified voice, it's not the kid's fault. There was no clarity of message. Right, so that's a remiss to the idea that the voices have to be the same. Similarly to the idea of deafness. If father and mother are deaf to their own message, the child cannot be responsible for ignoring it. We sometimes have, the Kotzker Rebbe once remarked that he is waiting to see the ultimate child that is born at the end of time, to which every generation was doing mitzvahs. Like people will often say, I'm doing this for my children. And my children grow up and they're doing it for their children. And they're doing it for their children. So who is the ultimate child for whom everything is being done? You'd like to meet that ultimate child. And often, parents expect their children to adhere to a certain standard of behavior that the parents themselves don't live to. So, a father might be schmoozing in shul, and he'll momentarily stop his schmoozing to tell his son, stop talking, daven. Then go back to schmoozing. I remember years ago, I was a member of a board of education, a Vad HaChinuch of a day school, and it was a modern Orthodox school, and parents were discussing how they could increase the learning opportunities for their children after school. It was already a long day, not as long as here in Israel, but it was for America it was a long day, like 5 o'clock, and let's have more learning. Now, one of the unfortunate things that rabbis pick up is that rabbis happen to know the schedules of many people. And I knew for a fact that a lot of these parents that are calling for extra learning for their kids were not necessarily putting in extra learning themselves. So when you ask the question, how do I increase my son's desire to learn Torah? The real answer is, or part of the answer is, by learning more Torah yourself. Because if a child sees that the parents are not gravitating to Limud Torah, but the parent is giving you a lecture to learn more, as Rav Hutner said, when you tell your son not to talk during davening, when you talk during davening, your son does not learn not to talk during davening. Your son learns that when he has a son, he'll tell his son not to talk during davening. That's the behavior that's going to be imitated. So once again, the person is not a ben soreh umoreh if the parents are deaf to their own message. When we listen to our message, then we can hope our children will listen to our message. If we don't listen to our message, then how can the kid be at fault, one way or the other? So these technical requirements actually are very important in the world of chinuch, in the world of raising our children. But now, going backwards, I want to go to the first topic of the Parsha, which is very, very difficult. The Torah says when you go out to war against your enemy and you see in captivity a beautiful woman that you desire, again, I'm speaking from the man's perspective because that's how the Torah describes it. So it says you have relations with her. So I first want to point out a very important point, which maybe not everybody agrees with, but it's a very authoritative source that you need to keep in mind. This is the commentary Tosfos Rid. Rid is an abbreviation, Rabbi Yeshaya di Trani. Rabbi Yeshaya from Trani. He was an Italian Rishon of great, great authority, and he wrote many chidushim on Shas. And the Tosfos Rid makes a very important point, contrary to what many people think. Eishes Shefas Toar is not a legitimation of wartime rape. If the woman does not consent, it is forbidden, God forbid, to rape. Eishes Shefas Toar is only in a context of consensual relationship. Now that's very important. Most people don't understand the Chumash the way most people say, oh, it's a time of war, passions are high, so the Torah allows rape. That would be a war crime. Well, even in halacha, that would be a war crime. And the Tosfos Rid is Machadesh, very important Tosfos Rid, that the whole Parsha of Eishes Shefas Toar is talking about consensual relationship, and it is not talking about coercive relationship. Okay, Baruch Hashem, that takes away some of the big ethical problems people have, but still, it's extremely problematical. She's not Jewish, for one thing. So the Torah is permitting a man in time of war to have one consensual sexual encounter with a prisoner of war. Only one bite at the apple. Afterwards, if you want to continue the relationship, there's a whole ritual that you have to go through, etc. And if you don't want to go through with that, she goes free. You cannot keep her as a servant. Your only choice is either she goes through the process and you marry her, and then she has the same rights as any wife, or she goes free and she cannot be a servant. Right? So you can't continually abuse her in that way. But one free bite at the apple the man gets, provided, of course, like the Teitzei says, it's consensual and it's not coercive. How could this be? How could the Torah allow such a thing? How could the Torah allow sexual intercourse with a Gentile? I mean, after all, the Chumash itself, when we fornicated with the daughters of Moab, that resulted in a plague. 24,000 Jews died, and they would have continued to die had not Pinchas stepped up and killed Zimri and Cosby. Right? Zimri was the head of the tribe of Shimon, and Cosby was the Midianite woman. And yet the Torah allows it. So the answer that Rashi gives, and again, if I'm not able to fully explain this, it's because I cannot fully explain this. Rashi says, again, from Chazal, he didn't make it up, that this is a concession to the Yetzer Hara. Passions are very, very, very powerful in time of war, when a person is afraid of losing their life. Their emotions are at the edge. And sometimes they do things that are uncontrollable. And even if God were to prohibit it, as he normally would, they would violate it anyway. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu concedes to the Yetzer Hara and then regulates it by then requiring a whole ceremony for continuation, because otherwise the law would be violated without regulation. And therefore HaKadosh Baruch Hu makes a shikul of concessions to the Yetzer Hara. Again, it's very, very difficult for us, but let me share with you a beautiful allegory that the Or HaChaim develops based on the Zohar. It is true, of course, that the pasuk is directly talking about a non-Jewish captive of war. But the Or HaChaim, based on the Zohar, says that Eishes Shifat Toar is an allegory for the journey of the soul. And all of the psukim can be understood in this allegorical, mystical way. Ki Teitzei la milchama al oyevecha. When you go out to war against your enemy, says the Or HaChaim, who is the greatest enemy that a human being has in their life? It's the Yetzer Hara. That's the biggest enemy of all. And we have to wage war against the Yetzer Hara. We have urges to be selfish, to be egotistical, to rebel against God, to be lazy, to shirk our responsibilities. And every single day, we have that voice that's pulling us in a direction we don't want to go. You got to wage war against the Yetzer Hara. And what does the pasuk say? When you wage war against the Yetzer Hara, Hashem gives you a promise. Unisano Hashem Elokecha biyadecha. Hashem will deliver the Yetzer Hara to you. You will be able to win. If you sincerely wage war against the Yetzer Hara, Hashem will give you victory. So that's the first thing, kind of a reassuring note. This is a war. Again, we may backslide, but this is a war that fundamentally we're capable of winning. The message is, of course, don't give up the fight. Never feel your matzav is hopeless. Never feel there's nowhere for you to go. Wage war against that Yetzer Hara. And God will deliver the Yetzer Hara into your hands, into your control. Again, they say in the name of the Vilna Gaon that when you're davening Shemona Esrei, and all of us have this problem, our mind wanders. We're saying the words, but our mind wanders into other things. We have this experience that somehow I was in the fourth bracha, Tzlach Lanu, and all of a sudden I'm in Shema Kolenu. I'm kind of way ahead. Like, where did I go from there to there? Like, where was I? And presumably I said the words. I actually did say the words. But I have no memory of how I got from there to there. It's like an alcoholic, the last weekend. I just don't remember. How did I get to Las Vegas? Somehow I'm there. So the Vilna Gaon says the following. If the Yetzer Hara wins, when you said Salach Lanu, you weren't focusing, then you'll get him on Re'ena, meaning you lost this bracha, don't give up. Try to win in the next bracha. You didn't get this line right, try to get the next line right. Don't make the mistake of kind of saying, it's not worth it anymore. Even in learning. It's interesting. Sometimes a person has a learning session in yeshiva, and the learning session didn't go very well. So there's only a half an hour left. There's only 15 minutes left. So it's natural for a person to say, okay, today is not going good. Let's just call it a day. But that's not really the way we should react. We should kind of say, I got 15 minutes. I got 5 minutes left. Let me make the 5 minutes good. Yeah, maybe I wasted, 3.5 hours. I can do something for 5 minutes that's worthwhile. The Alter of Kelm, Reb Simcha Zissel of Kelm, Rabbi Yisrael Salanter's great Talmud, had a yeshiva for really high school boys. It was really a yeshiva katana, Kelm. You don't realize this. And one of his rituals, he had many different rituals to train people in character. One of his rituals was that in the middle of the night, the kids had to get up. These were like 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds. They had to get up and learn for 5 minutes. No more and no less. No more even. Now, when your whole learning session is only going to be 5 minutes, you can't really be late. Meaning they woke them up, let's say, 15 minutes before, and they gave them time to get dressed and everything else. 5 minutes, got to go to the base medrash for 5 minutes. What's the purpose of that? Just to wake somebody up, say, learn for 5 minutes? The answer is to understand that 5 minutes are worthwhile too. The chashivas of time, right? Don't give up. So that's the first message of the pasuk. When you wage war against your Yetzer Hara, God will give you victory. Then we continue the allegory. You see in captivity a beautiful woman, and you desire her, and you want to marry her. He says the following from the Zohar. The beautiful woman is none other than your neshama, which is beautiful. It's radiant. It is the breath of God. And I see my neshama as if it's held captive. And again, the Tanya discusses this metaphor generally. Actually, it's not a metaphor, it's a reality. He discusses the idea of a neshama which is so divine and holy as being imprisoned in this body, yearning to be connected to Hashem, but it's imprisoned, and every Aveira that we do imprisons it, locks it up, chains it up, where it's not able to express itself. So you look at this beautiful neshama. You see its captivity, you see its suffering, you see its distance, and you want to be reunited with your own neshama. That's why the idea of chuva, which means return, doesn't only mean return to God. Of course it means that. But it also means returning to yourself. I want to be connected with myself, my true identity, who I am. So I see this beautiful woman in captivity and I want to be unified with her. So what do? So let's look at the rituals. The rituals that the Torah talks about is, you bring her into your house, you shave her hair, right? You shave her hair, and you let her fingernails grow long. Again, Rashi explains you want to make her unattractive so you won't want to marry. In other words, you'll have a heter to marry her if you really want it, but the Torah tries to discourage that from happening by requiring that she shave her hair. Again, this is before Satmar, shaving hair, and fingernails grow very long, and she cries for her father and mother for 30 days. And then if you still want her, you could be with her. So here's what the allegory says. Shaving the hair is part of a chuva process in the sense of divesting yourself from the foreign ideology, right? The hair comes out of the head. So it doesn't come out of the brain, but it represents the ideas in your head. That as part of your introspective process, you got to divest yourself of the foreign ideologies and philosophies that lead a person astray. Get rid of them. Shave them away. The hands grasp things. The hands represent an over-connection to materialism. So when the fingernails grow long, you're not able to grasp things. So therefore, the two steps of shaving the hair, divest yourself of foreign ideologies and values, and distance yourself from the emptiness of materialistic acquisition. Then it says, let your neshama cry over her father and her mother. Her father is Hashem. Her mother is the Jewish people. Cry over the fact that with our Averos, we've created a distancing between ourselves and Hashem. We've lost our father, so to speak, although we can get him back. And we've also betrayed the Jewish people because, as we said a few weeks ago, Kol Yisrael Areivin Zelaseh, every Jew is responsible. So when I do Averos, it's not just me, I affect Am Yisrael. So therefore, shave the hair, divest yourself of false ideologies. Let the fingernails grow, disengage from materialism. Cry and mourn and grieve over the distance you have with Hashem. And cry over the betrayal we've done to Am Yisrael. And do it for Yerech Yamim, a month. This is the kicker. This is the month of Elul. It doesn't say 30 days, it says a month. Elul was 29 days. And therefore, this is the Zaman of Chodesh Elul. And then, Hayisa L'cha Le'isha, you can marry the Esha Shafas Torah. You can become reunited with your neshama. You can become purified. You can become elevated. You can become reconnected to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now, of course, this is not the simple meaning of the verse. The verse is referring to a particular halachic situation, which is still controversial, and it's hard for us to fully understand that situation. But the Torah has 70 faces. There are deeper meanings to everything in the Torah. And the Orach Chaim, and based on the Zohar, says that the deeper meaning of Esha Shafas Torah is the reunification of my being with my inner essence through the chuva and the introspection, particularly during the month of Elul. Okay? So this is, again, a very beautiful thought, connecting Esha Shafas Torah to the tshuva of the month of Elul. But I want to raise a final question on this. Rashi has a comment. There are two types of wars that exist in the halachic system. One is called a milchemes mitzvah, a mitzvah war, a war that you are commanded to wage. And the other, which we cannot do today because you actually need prophetic authorization through the Urim V'Tumim, is milchemes reshus, optional wars of expansion, which we cannot do today. Today, the only type of war we could halachically wage is milchemet mitzvah. Milchemet mitzvah, the Rambam writes, there are three cases of milchemet mitzvah. One is the milchama to eradicate the 7 nations of Canaan. The other is Amalek. The third, which is the war we're engaged in, is a war against enemies that seek to destroy the Jewish people. Defensive wars. That's called milchemes mitzvah. And maybe for another time we'll discuss the exemption, if there is an exemption, for yeshiva students from milchemes mitzvah. It's not a simple situation. But that's called milchemes mitzvah. Now, a second category of war is called milchemet reshut. Now that may sound funny. Milchemet reshut actually means an optional war of aggressive expansion. Israel decides to invade Kuwait. Now, that immediately kind of doesn't sound good. You mean halacha allows aggressive wars that are not undertaken for defense? Well, actually, yes, but the rules there are very, very strict. You have to have a melech, you have to have a Sanhedrin, and this is really the most important thing, the Urim V'Tumim, the Kohen Gadol's breastplate that communicates prophetic messages from God, has to give you permission. Which means, in other words, you can invade Kuwait if HaKadosh Baruch Hu told you could invade Kuwait. If Hashem doesn't tell you can invade Kuwait, you can't, unless it's a defensive type of operation. Which means, practically, milchemet reshut is a virtual non-existent category. We don't have prophecy today, so it's not possible. And Amalek is extinct, at least genealogically extinct. The 7 nations are extinct. So as a result, the only residual category of war that is halachically legitimate bisman hazeh is milchemet defense, which of course, unfortunately, the state of Israel has faced repeatedly. And over the past year, can you imagine? I mean, obviously October 7 was a shock, but we're approaching a year of this milchama. And the truth of the matter is, there's no particular end. We hope a new year will bring new bracha. It's very important. On Rosh Hashanah, everything is readjusted anew. So things can change, turn on a dime. But B'ezras Hashem, we hope that will be. The truth is, I hope the war will end before Rosh Hashanah. But B'chal HaPachos, in the new year, should be a year of bracha. Okay. Milchemes mitzvah versus milchemet reshus. Okay. Rashi comments from the Sifri. Which type of war is Eshet Yifat Toar talking about? Is Eshet Yifat Toar talking about a mitzvah war? Or is it talking about an optional war, when such a thing could be authorized? So Rashi says it's actually talking about an optional war. Because in a mitzvah war, at least the mitzvah war that you're waging against Amalek and the 7 nations, there are no captives. You have to kill everybody. And since the Torah is talking about a situation where there are captives of war, that could only be milchemet reshut. It could not be milchemet mitzvah, because milchemet mitzvah, you don't have vishavisa shivyo, you have captured captives of war. So here's the thing. If that's the case, there seems to be a disconnect, an inconsistency, a contradiction between the pshat of the pasuk and the allegory. The Torah is talking about milchemes reshut, optional wars. Now, the Orach Chaim and the Zohar reads the whole Parsha of Yifat Toar as the war against the Yetzer Hara. So here's my question. If I were to ask you, is the war against the Yetzer Hara a mitzvah war? Or is the war against the Yetzer Hara an optional war? Our answer would certainly be the war against the Yetzer Hara is the greatest mitzvah there could possibly be. That's my life. So here's the problem. If the Torah in the Parsha of Eishes Shafas Toar is trying on a deeper level to teach me about fighting the Yetzer Hara, why does it situate that lesson in a Parsha that's talking about optional wars, if the Milchemet HaYetzer is certainly a mitzvah war? In other words, it's in the wrong place at that point. Once you tell me, oh, this is talking about an optional war, and then you tell me, oh, it also talks about the war against the Yetzer Hara, that doesn't fit. Somehow the Torah should have communicated this message when it talks about Amalek and the 7 nations. It could have put in killing the Amalek of your Yetzer Hara. It could have done that. It's in the wrong place, in other words. So the answer is actually a very deep answer. The answer is, the Torah is teaching me that even though the war against the Yetzer Hara is a mitzvah war, you have to fight it the way you fight an optional war, and not the way you fight a mitzvah war. You fight the Milchemes HaYetzer like a Milchemes Rishus, and not like a Milchemes Mitzvah. How so? Let's examine again the paradigm between, the difference between the two. Milchemes Mitzvah is total obliteration of the enemy. Amalek must be wiped out. The 7 nations of Canaan must be wiped out. Milchemes Rishus, you don't destroy the enemy, you capture the enemy. Chazal are being merames, perhaps, or the Zohar is being merames, that your tshuva process does not involve obliteration. It involves capture and transformation. So let me give you a concrete example. Rav Soloveitchik, who has a beautiful book, some that Rabbi Pinchas Pelia made of adapting his shiurim, talks about 2 different modalities of doing tshuva. Let's imagine a person has many, many years they were off the derech, and it may not even have been their fault. They were living lives very distant from Hashem. And then when they're 20 or 30 or 40 or 50, they finally turn to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. How do they view those past years? Good, my life is on the right path right now, Baruch Hashem. But what about those 20 or 30 years? So one psychological way of viewing it is you simply say, that's dead time. Those were the years of nothingness. That's called the chuva of amputation. You simply cut off those years. They don't exist anymore. I'm a new person. Those years are gone. I simply amputate them. My life began when I was 30. Sometimes that is necessary. Sometimes there's such toxicity, such negativity, such evil in terms of being connected with people, that all you can do is amputate. In the same way there sometimes has to be a medical amputation, there sometimes has to be a spiritual amputation. But in reality, amputation is a last resort, not a first resort. Number one, when you try to amputate, there is what we call phantom pain. You haven't really gotten rid of it. Just like when you try to delete complex computer programs or emails, as many criminals have discovered, you can't really get rid of everything. Although it's funny, when I need to retrieve something deleted, it's enormously difficult, but somehow, when I don't want it to be retrieved, somehow they find ways to retrieve it, or whatever it is. And number two, when your chuva is amputation, you're left with zero, meaning I've gotten rid of the sins. Good. I've distanced myself from those sins. God has forgiven those sins. But forgiving the sin doesn't create anything positive in your bank account. All I have is empty time, wasted time. In fact, one could even ask to God, it's unfair. You put me in an environment where X number of years I didn't have those opportunities. That's just not fair. But there's another modality of tshuva, which is very, very different. It is not the modality of cutting off my past, but I draw on that very past as the foundation for how I serve God. And had I not had that even dysfunctional past, I would not be in the position that I'm in. Simple example, the drug addict. So he kicked the habit, now he's good. One way of looking at it is I forget about that part of my life and I go on. And that's wonderful. But that does mean he's stuck with 20 years of zero. But what if he becomes, let's say, a drug and alcohol addiction counselor? Do you see the difference there? There, what's going on is not forgetting about his past. It's using his past as the unique source of his strength. Had he not been a drug addict, he wouldn't have been able to have the empathy and the understanding to help people. So I look at my past and I say, that is what I will derive my strength in avodas Hashem. That is not the tshuva of eradication. That is not the tshuva of milchemes mitzvah, where you destroy the enemy. That's the tshuva where you recapture the enemy and you make him your servant. Psychologists call that reframing, which means tshuva does not only change my future, tshuva can redefine the meaning of my past. And this is very important because many, many people, when they become Baalei Tshuva, they may have pressures to kind of forget about that prior life. That can cause depression, that can cause sadness, that can actually cause phantom pain in a lot of ways. But if the avodah is a little different, don't forget about that prior life. Use that prior life. And that actually answers the injustice question. Because people say, how come some neshamos get to be born in families that have been frum for 300 years? And I'm born in South Dakota or Montana. There were no Orthodox shuls. There was nobody there. God gave me a bad deal. But the answer is God didn't give you a bad deal. God gives you a bad deal if you think your avodah is to kind of be like the Mei Hasharim person. And then you're going to say, I never had the chance. But the secret is, if the Mei Hasharim person has something I'll never have, the person who was born in South Dakota has something the Mei Hasharim person didn't have. There was a reason why Hashem put you in South Dakota. There's a reason why you grew up into Montana. And therefore, your tshuva is not about forgetting about it. Your tshuva is drawing upon it. And that's why tshuva is in the Parsha of Milchemes Rishus, not Milchemes. I just want to end. I'm running a little late today. I just want to end with the idea that many of you know the Rosh Hashiva of Mir, the great one, Rosh Hashiva was Nifter of Nassan Tzvi Finkel, who died tragically. He was very ill for many years, but he died when we did not expect him to die. And he has a famous story that's well known in the yeshiva world. He grew up in a Orthodox family. He was not a Baal Teshuva in any way, but he grew up in an Orthodox family, but it was a more modern environment. He went to a co-ed high school. He was on the basketball team, the debating team, girlfriends, all of those things. Then he came to Mir, and he became, the great Rosh Hashiva, the great Gadol, and the like. So I remember when he died suddenly, and I went to the Levaya. So all of the speakers emphasized, this is what they saw the lesson of his life was. You see a person who grew up in such a decrepit, degenerate environment of evil, empty materialism and taiva, and his greatness was he escaped that environment. He transcended that environment. He was able to go beyond that environment. Well, having come from somewhat of a similar environment, I was actually a little offended a little bit. I don't remember, growing up in Hartford, Connecticut in a co-ed school as the worst possible thing that ever happened. And I'll tell you something. The greatness of Rav Nosson Tzvi, part of his greatness, was not only his escaping the environment, but his reclaiming the environment. One of his great abilities was that there would be kids from co-ed schools, modern Orthodox schools, who would come to Israel, never exposed to intensive Torah study. And they would come to him, and Rosh Yeshiva of Mir, long black coat, long beard. They figure they would have no connection to his world at all. And all of a sudden, he starts talking about jump shots and all sorts of basketball terms that I don't know myself. And the kids were so amazed, all of this? And he was able to communicate that he was part of that world. And he understood what the kids were going through. He didn't deny that origin. He took the positive features from that origin and he used it to connect with people who otherwise, there were many Gedolim who never, Baruch Hashem, they never had those challenges. There was a Gadol they once asked, to give you an example of, the different world that many Gedolim come from. They asked a certain Gadol, are you allowed to play basketball on Shabbos if there's an Erev? So the Gadol said, what's basketball? Kadorsal? He says, basketball, you take a ball and you throw it through a basket and it goes through. So the person said, I don't understand. Why can't you put it in the basket before Shabbos? Again, these are truly, truly great people. But they don't get it. Again, I'm not saying this as criticism, but in other words, this was not their world. And sometimes to connect to people who come from a certain world, you have to share that world. The point I'm making is that the greatness of Rav Nosson Tzvi was not that he repudiated his environment, but he captured it and he used it. And this, I would suggest, is the paradigm of Milchemes Rishus. Milchemes HaYetzer is Milchemes Mitzvah, but you got to fight it like a Milchemes Rishus. The tshuva of amputation is inferior to the tshuva of capturing it and using it. So B'ezras Hashem, I hope that all of us can be zocha to take every feature of our past and use it as a source of our strength and a source of our uniqueness. So, good Shabbos, good Chodesh.
Yiboneh Chessed Fund.